Good morning, everyone. Or it's almost afternoon, so almost afternoon. Almost good afternoon. So I'm Meredith Davidson. I'm our 19th and 20th Century Southwest Collections Curator, which I'm sure you're sick of hearing. And on behalf of the museum, I want to welcome you to the second day of our Fred Harvey weekend. As I mentioned yesterday, this is the 7th year that we've done programming in some capacity around Fred Harvey. Today, we have a very full day. We'll start with a talk now and then have a break for about an hour for lunch. We talked with the people on the panel for the 1 o'clock talk, and we're thinking that we're going to start at 1:15 to give people like a little bit more time to grab some lunch. And I'm seeing heads nod, so I'll let the front desk know for people who are maybe just coming for that talk that we'll start at about 1:15, and just plan on everyone else, you all who are here, if you're coming back for the afternoon, that we'll start at 1:15 to give you a little bit more time. I just want to say a few things before we get started with the first talk. I want to thank everyone who came to the dinner last night. One of the aspects of the fundraiser that we did last night was a big postcard where we tried to connect every stop from basically a postcard from the 1920s along the railroad, every stop that had a Harvey hotel or eating house, from Chicago to Los Angeles, and we did it. So good job, sponsors, well done. And as part of the recognition, I mentioned, or I think Jamie mentioned that we would say who sponsored, so I just want to read a couple of names to give people a little bit of recognition and thank these folks for sponsoring a spot along the line. So Douglas Beck, Steve Harvey, Alan Affelt, Mr. and Mr. Wibble, Lloyd and Betty Van Horn, Judy and Dennis Reinhardt, Helen Harvey Mills, Matt DeGregory, Julian Harvey, Barbara Felix, Kay Montano, Charles Harvey, Sherry and Jim Davis, Howard Davis, Melissa Bugasset. Am I saying her last name right? Is she here? Are you? Bogish. Bogish. I wasn't even close. Jeez. Bernard Yule. Thank you, Stephen. Bernard Yule, Perez and Clinton, Corky Brown, and Richard Perry. So I just want to say thank you all for doing that. Last night we were able to connect that line and get a little bit of funding to keep doing these sorts of programs for the museum, so I'm really grateful to you all. And for those of you who didn't go to the dinner last night, we have another opportunity that was sort of part of what we did last night, and we're going to extend it to this morning and to today. For $50, you can host a Harvey Girl. We'll put your name on this page, and I'll take some information from you on a pledge form. And we would love your support for just $50 to support the weekends that we do. All of that money will go towards the New Mexico History Museum's public programs and exhibitions funding, and we would welcome your support. And the reason that the talks this year are free, and if you came last year, you might remember we did a ticketed cost last year. The reason they're free this year is because we really like to encourage opportunities to do programs where they're accessible to people who might not be able to pay larger amounts for tickets. So we like to do free programming, and the way that we're able to do free programming is through support, through membership, and through direct donations like these. So I encourage you to find me and fill out a pledge form and help us keep these weekends going. So with that little piece, if you have a cell phone, let me ask you to turn it off or put it on silent. If you need to leave for the restroom, they are underneath us here, so you can leave through that door, or they're up on the first floor. And our first talk is by Nicolasa Chavez, who I wrote some notes down. She's been at the International Folk Art Museum up on Museum Hill for 10 years. And is their curator of Spanish colonial art, and a really fabulous curator. Her shows are always really good. And just to name a few of the shows, if you haven't been up there recently, one of her earlier shows was Century of Masters, NEA National Heritage Fellows. After that, you all might have seen this show that traveled, so you might have even seen it elsewhere besides here, was Red That Colored the World. How many of you all saw that? Oh my gosh, it's so good. Wasn't it? Oh my god, it's so good. Then she did New World Cuisine, The Histories of Chocolate, Mate y Mas. Did you see that one?
Yeah.
Oh my god, that one was good too.
Weight during
Yeah. Did you hear her? She goes, I gained weight during that one. So did we. She had a smelling station. That was so cool. I was like, oh, that's great. And then her recent one was Flamenco, Spain to New Mexico. And Flamenco, if you didn't see it, it came down this year, recently in September.
September, Fiesta Weekend.
Over Fiesta Weekend it came down, but it's traveling. So I think it's going to Silver City first.
Yeah, opens the weekend of January 13th in Silver City.
Opens January 13th, 2018 in Silver City. So if you missed it and you want a reason to go to some hot springs in the south of the state, now you have a second reason to go.
Where in Silver City?
At the History Museum there, the old historic house. So our big challenge is fitting everything into all these different small ones.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out.
That museum is so great. It's like a little, it's funky.
Beautiful.
Going anywhere in Arizona?
Not yet. We're trying to do a national tour after the New Mexican tour.
Do you want it to go to your museum?
Well, we don't have space for it, but
You might.
yeah.
We should talk. That's I'll show you. Okay. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Nicolasa Chavez and help me welcome her. I'm going to take this.
Well, I'm very honored and happy to be here today. Nervous. I'm in front of a bunch of people that know more about Harvey history than I do. I grew up with the History Museum here in New Mexico. My father directed it for years, and I have always loved this place, the collections here, and that led me into also wanting to do history and become a curator. However, I rebelled as a teenager and didn't want anything to do with New Mexican art and cultures, and I had relatives in Spanish Market. I went into modern European history. Hence, I did fit flamenco into that, being a Spanish art form. But coming full circle, back in New Mexico, back with Spanish colonial and contemporary Latino Hispano collections at the Museum of International Folk Art, people always ask, what is contemporary Latino Hispano? It can mean almost anything depending on what part of the country you're in and what you're collecting. We differentiate it. We have a Latin American curator. I do the New Mexican artwork and the continued living traditions based on the colonial period, and there's a lot of overlap between our two positions. So it has been really joyous and wonderful to be at the Folk Art Museum, and I have to say I'm really happy to give this talk today because Meredith asked me to talk about the Spanish colonial collections within the Harvey collection, which happen to be some of my absolute favorite pieces in the collection at the Folk Art Museum. And when I started there 10 years ago, when you start, anytime you go to a new museum, the first 6 months, and even now you're still discovering, but you are supposed to learn your collection. Just spend a lot of time in the vaults with the accessions records, studying the collections. And there were several pieces that were already my favorite pieces at the museum. I worked at Museum of Spanish Colonial Art prior and also curated the collection at Casa San Isidro. So all of us Spanish colonial curators kind of know each other's collections and would borrow from each other, or giving talks we'd want to use an image. So there were several pieces at Moifa that I've always loved. I started studying history of chocolate back at Moscow when I was at Spanish Colonial Art, and one of my favorite pieces is the silver manzanita, which I will show today, that is part of the Harvey collection, and we'll get more into what that is. And I did an exhibit on the Mantón de Manila, which is the Spanish silk shawls that are embroidered, that people still break out and wear here, harkening to their Spanish roots. However, these shawls actually originated in China, and several of those shawls I borrowed from the Folk Art Museum, and one of those is a 19th century piece that was also in the flamenco exhibit, and again, part of the Harvey collection. So what I really want to share today is the actual pieces that came to the museum. I'll do a very brief background of how the objects came to the museum. I know this is a conference that's been going on for years, so there's been a lot of really in-depth histories about the Harvey Company. I don't know how much of the talks have been about the collecting. However, the Spanish colonial collection is actually pretty small in comparison to the Native American works. There was a total of about 6,000 objects collected between 1902 and 1940, and the museum, our museum, received 150 Spanish colonial items gifted from the Fred Harvey Art Foundation. And that gift came in 1979. We had housed the collection and worked on it under E. Boyd and Alan Vedder, who were the curators and conservators at the time. So the pieces were actually on long-term loan from 1969. Then in 79, they became a permanent gift. And a part of that gift agreement was to display and show and use these collections for education and for people to learn about the colonial period and the artwork. So there was a big exhibit called Colonial Frontiers that highlighted the Fred Harvey collection, and then a publication came out with that. So a lot of my notes on some of the objects, when I go into the accession records, it's those original accession records that came in 79 that helped me inform future exhibits. And every exhibit I've had at the museum, with the exception of Century of Masters, all have incorporated pieces from the Harvey collection. So as I show pieces, I'll talk about some of the ones that have gone into different exhibits, particularly New World Cuisine, very Harvey heavy, because there's a lot of serviceware, colonial silver, a chocolate storage jar that's just amazing. It's debated, some say it was stored with wine, other past curators say it smells like chocolate still when you open it. So it could have been a wine storage jar or a chocolate storage jar. But some wonderful pieces. Hold on, a little arrow bend. So early on, after Fred Harvey died in 1901, this is when the real collecting started. And the Alvarado Hotel and the Alvarado train station in Albuquerque was home to the Indian Building, which many of you have probably heard about and know about. And I really love these early black and white pictures because we're going to see a lot of these objects still in collections today. And I might mention, oops, I accidentally hit that one. Let me go back. So we have utilitarian goods, fine arts, wonderful pieces, farm implements, agricultural tools. So I think the breadth of the collection is really amazing because you have really, really fine Mexican silver pieces alongside some of the items that I really love. There's a grease bucket in our collection. And that's for collecting your grease so you can make lard and different things and cook with it. So New World Cuisine, I brought up a lot of utilitarian implements into the show, along with finer table services and ceramics and silver candlesticks, different items. And wine vats. We had a section in that exhibit on the history of wine. New Mexico was the earliest wine region in the continental United States. The Franciscan friars brought up grapes as early as 1529 into southern New Mexico. So we do have a wonderful wine vat in our collection. So all the different traditions that were collected, again, the breadth of the Spanish colonial collection of the Harvey collection had fine examples from Mexico. And then in New Mexico, it really tried to compare and contrast what was considered rustic or naive or different terms used for New Mexican art. We were the northernmost frontier of the Viceroyalty Nueva España. So we don't think of a border. We were Mexico and New Mexico were one and the same. However, artistically, you will see strong regional differences, although there are similarities. And this is a beautiful example by Jose Aragon, who was an early santero in New Mexico, late 18th, early 19th century. He did several redondo pieces, or translated into dondo is the shortened term of that word. Most of our retablos are rectangular in shape. Some will have a lunette or media rosette on top of the retablo, but this particular piece is a nice and rare example. I have to watch my arm there. This is Nuestra Señora de los Refugio de los Pecadores, Our Lady of Refuge of Sinners. So you can pray to her for forgiveness, or if you need help getting through something hard, that she's there to help you with that. It's a wonderful decorative piece that I really like the detailing. And going back into the collecting a little bit here, it was Herman Schweitzer was one of the early collectors, along with Harvey's brother Ford Harvey, his sister and brother-in-law, John Frederick Hunkle. And early on, they went out, and it was really Herman who was known to have this eye right away. As a young boy, he started at age 16, 17, already collecting Navajo art, weavings, silver, that sort of thing. And then spent years going into Mexico and collecting, and early descriptions just describe that he was a natural at seeing works of beauty and seeing works of detail and handcrafted items and bringing them in. So really going out into the communities with other pickers, interviewing people, looking for people bringing in items, just always searching and always finding, and had a long list of connections through New Mexico and Mexico. So Jose Aragon was one of our more prominent santeros, early santeros, and this is a fine example of his work. And we have many works by many other santeros in the collection that were collected at this time. And then three-dimensional wood carvings called bultos, or the historical term, art historical term is a polychrome painted wood sculpture, but we refer to them as bultos. Santo is actually a term that refers to both retablos and bultos. So when you talk about a santo, it can be the flat painting on wood or the carved painting. And this is a wonderful example, early on attributed to Fray Andres Garcia, based on some writings from 1776 describing works in the churches. However, other art historians and folklorists have come in and said there's not enough to attribute it to that. So this is a santero that is referred to as the St. Joseph or San Jose Santero, because he specialized in just 3 images of San Jose. And this particular piece was a piece, when we were doing Red That Colored the World, we went through the collections and picked quite a few pieces of New Mexican art for testing to find traces of a cochineal red, because that's what we wanted to really show in the exhibit, was finding the use of cochineal, or how often it was used here or not used here. And we found pieces like this, so instantly we'd look for red. Cochineal can come in many different shades of red, and that's where it's challenging. You have your deep, deep berries, almost purple to orange, all these colors, and this had kind of this orangish hue, and then underneath was a berry red coming out. So there are traces of cochineal on this piece, and several others from the Harvey collection were in that grouping of testing, including weavings. However, we found cochineal wasn't the only red that was used in New Mexico. It was highly prized, it was expensive, it didn't grow here naturally, so it'd be used as a lake pigment over vermilion and other types of reds, and this is an example of that. Hide paintings were another art form here developed in New Mexico, and what I really love about the pieces in the Harvey collection is they show this blending of cultures and what makes New Mexican art unique. So the Spanish were bringing all these European traditions into the Americas, and in Mexico City, the European traditions really took hold and took over your churches. Everywhere you see European-style paintings. However, in New Mexico, the Spanish bring up those traditions, but they're also remote. They're far away from the major capital and the big cities. We often don't think about when the Spaniards arrived. There were pueblos, but there weren't towns. So whatever the Spanish settled, they had to build from scratch. And a lot of times this was city folk coming out into really the wild yonder, land they'd never known or seen before. Like for us, it would be, I guess, landing on Mars and having to construct from the ground up. But they also learned and exchanged traditions with the Native Americans that were living here. And one of those was hide painting that has been done for centuries and centuries. So for the Spanish, if you didn't have your canvas and your linens and different things, you learned the tradition of tanning your hide and painting upon it. So our churches here in New Mexico were decorated with hide paintings, most of which are religious scenes or of saints. Laguna Pueblo is probably the most famous because it still has a lot of the paintings intact that you can still see today. In our collection, we have one of the largest collections of hide paintings in the Southwest. Many of those, again, coming from this collection from the Harvey Foundation. And this is a beautiful example of Cristo Crucificado. This is a very large, huge painting about this wide, probably 7 feet, 6 to 7 feet tall. So imagine tanning that and painting it, the techniques and how long it would take, and the use of natural pigments. So here, the Spanish are picking up local dyes, natural pigments from Native American tribes everywhere, and then they're bringing in indigo and different things from Mexico that are coming in from Asia and different places, and indigo is a really big product along with cochineal. We actually, I think, see a lot more indigo in many of our pieces here, because in our weavings too, we're going to see a nice example of some blues, but you can see the blue Cape of the Virgin there. It's just really bright and prominent still, so it's very color fast, it doesn't fade. But again, a lot of these pieces that came in have really allowed for study and comparison. So this collection, my big point is that it really lives on and keeps informing future exhibits, future projects, and future research. And we did also test several height paintings for Colonial that did also come out showing positive. So Colonial was used on height as well. And then we get into textile traditions in the colonial period in Mexico and New Mexico, the embroidery techniques that were brought over from Spain to the New World, and also techniques that were brought via the Manila galleons from Asia over. So I mentioned the mantones de Manila, which I actually didn't include a picture of one in this slide presentation, but the embroidery here shows the style of flat stitch or satin stitch that was used in China and Asia, and then that stitch was brought into Mexico and used there and brought back to Spain from the New World, so things from Asia would cross over in that direction versus the old Silk Road. So you had traditions coming from the Silk Road into Spain, you have stuff coming over from the Americas via the Manila galleons, and new styles. So the manton was one of those styles. You didn't really see the embroidered silk shawl prior to that, and it actually happened. The silk shawls themselves, most of the ones that exist now are 19th century, so they really started being changed at the end of the galleon period when Spain had the monopoly. But in Mexico, these traditions take a strong hold, and they're used largely done by nuns. Altar cloths, and sometimes your finer homes would have these as for their table settings or home altars. This is an example of a really fine cloth that would be used for specific times of the year, specific masses and celebrations. Colors change out based on times of the year, so the Lenten season, right before Easter, you would have darker hues, your deep purples, dark burgundies, dark browns, but also around Yule or Christmas time, you'd also have these more rich colors that would come out, and then you'd have your light and brighter colors coming out during summer at different times going along with the calendar. What's beautiful about a lot of the embroideries, again, you can look at clothing of the time period, activity from the time period. You'll see a woman there dressed, being drawn by horses. You'll get animal life, sometimes fantastical, but sometimes these pieces show daily life. And in New Mexico, this is true. Also, you get a lot of floral designs, you get a lot of scenes with horses, deer. Early on, I'll go next to a culture embroidery in New Mexico, but a lot of what we call traditional technique and style today, like when you go to Spanish Market, the end of July on the plaza, we see a lot of culture embroidery. These traditions still are with us today. However, they have gone through changes from the late 18th, early 19th century to the 21st. Early cultures, I'll go back to the Rebosa in a second. Early cultures, this is a prime example. You see that echoing of the altar cloth in Mexico. However, in New Mexico, it was the chorro sheep that the Spanish brought that really provided the material for embroidery here. So we didn't do the finer silk embroidery that you see down in Mexico. And they did grow silkworms down there and farm and make their own silk. But in New Mexico, the chorro sheep was the economic driver for our region. Rio Grande weavings were exported into Mexico. They were exported out from the Santa Fe Trail. They were one of our biggest economic drivers here. The chorro sheep were originally brought over as a food source, and they happened to reproduce so easily and so much, and probably weren't the best tasting food. I don't know why. It would be a ready, endless supply of food, but they were highly valued more for their wool, and as soon as it was kind of discovered that the wool was really useful, really strong, durable wool, they weren't herded for food. They were herded for their wool and for products. And again, when you came over, you might have had a trunk with your belongings. Everything else for your home you had to make here in New Mexico. The first piece of furniture would be a board chest, 6 plank chests. So most homes, that would be your first piece of furniture that was constructed because it was multi-use. And again, bedspreads, curtains, drapery, blankets, cushions, those are the items that culture embroidery first decorated. So now we see a culture where we can go buy a piece and frame it or hang it on our wall. It'll have an image of a saint. It'll still have a lot of flowers and vine-like motifs. However, early on, these were utilitarian objects, and the breadth of this collection has a lot of utilitarian, like I said, from the grease bucket to items of beauty for the home. The other thing this helps us with, because of the collecting and the real eye for classic examples of Spanish colonial period, we're able to see this transformation from early pieces to later 19th century pieces. And early culture was done on the backing of hand-spun sabanilla and hand-woven sabanilla, which is your wool backing, undyed natural wool. And then the culture embroidery would cover the entire piece. So sabanilla at that time wasn't meant to be seen, it was your backing. And you had all over culture stitch. So all the white you see here is actually the couching stitch as well as natural white wool. However, once items start coming from the East Coast on the railroads, it changes how culture embroidery is done. We start getting twill weaves and cottons and different things. So you'll have wool applied to cotton, but it's a way tighter weave. It's machine manufactured fabrics coming on the railroad. And the culture stitch is, it doesn't cover the entire piece anymore because it'd be so time consuming to try to get your needle through these tightly woven fabrics. Whereas sabanilla is just this nightlight. When you hold it up to the light, you can see through it, you cover the whole thing. So the style of culture changes, and we have several of these early examples in the Harvey collection, and they're definitely prized. Within our collection of culture, they're some of my favorite pieces. Now, go back to the rebozo. This is a beautiful rebozo. Again, rebozos are silk weaves down in Mexico. It is said that they were so popular and worn by every part of society, lower class up to the richest people. Everybody wore rebozos, depending on your status. You'd have a finer one. Ikat dyed rebozos. This one is really beautiful and unique, and I wish I could talk to Herman about how he located and found some of these pieces, because these are very rare. But this one again shows scenes of daily life in Mexico. So these are all scenes out at a public town square or a park. There's courting scenes involved. The deep berries are cochineal in this, so this was another piece that we tested and we did have on display for the red that colored the world. It is traveling with that exhibition right now. But I just really love the daily life of what we can learn. There's a man hunting. There is a maypole that people are dancing around. Again, you get an idea of what costume looks like from, this is contemporary of the time, so it'd be like somebody weaving something now and showing how we dress today. Many of the rebozos will be striped, like I said, or ikat, but when the embroidery is done on top of them, they're usually more for decorative purposes versus being worn as an item of clothing. So this is probably made for a church altar or a wealthy home again, and would be used to decorate the altar. Just an exquisite piece and another one of my favorites. So when we started planning Red, my first job was just to go through the collections and find those things that we should test for cochineal, and this was definitely one of them. And we also did test the orange, because orange is a predominant color in this piece, but that one did not come back positive for cochineal, just the little bits of berry you see that are almost a fuchsia. And this piece was the cover, and the back cover details from this piece were on the book Colonial Frontiers, which was edited by Christine Mather, who was the curator at the time when the collection came in, and she did all of the cataloging of this collection. And just a fine example, the saltillos serrapes done down in Mexico, which you see a lot of relationship with the Rio Grandes here. However, these are more tightly woven. This piece, there's pinks, there's reds, there's deep berries, there's burgundies. This one is traveling with the cochineal exhibit as well. We tested it for cochineal, sorry. I look at notes, my voice drops. But again, the saltillo tradition, a lot of these blankets were brought up into New Mexico, and then a lot of our blankets were traded down south. And these were done on a horizontal loom versus a vertical loom. So the horizontal loom was the European loom that came over and was used here with wool versus using cotton. However, some of these pieces will have a cotton warp and a wool weft on them sometimes. And just exquisite color. This one was really hard to find a decent image. It's an amazing piece. Oddly enough, there were a few Guatemalan pieces that ended up in the collection. Herman collected at Santos and weavings from Guatemala. Several of these exist. Ikat dyed natural white wool, and indigo dyed churro wool. Oh, not churro, down in Guatemala, it's a different wool. But this one ended up here in New Mexico, and let me forward to, there is a picture of it. If you look at this picture here, this is the Indian building again down in Albuquerque, the Alvarado Hotel, and on the bench there on the left is the blanket, the blue and white. So for me it's really fun to go through these old pictures and see those items that have made it into a collection that we still have. And again, everything from decorative, you'll see embroidered shawls and fans, bullfighter capes, beautiful weavings. The early picture we can go back to, there's beautiful silver candlesticks. This shawl here in the picture, even though it's black and white, I think it is this beautiful brown 19th century shawl that we have in the collection that has corals and yellows, and that was featured in the flamenco exhibit. It was paired with a bata de cola that belonged to Maria Benitez, and this shawl was wrapped around the mannequin with that. However, the shawl is so fragile, we're not traveling it now with the exhibits. We had to take some things out. So the shawl will be going on rest for a while to protect the piece. When the collection was given to us, conservation was a big, major issue because it was in the gift agreement itself. It's to preserve anything that comes to the museum, obviously, is to preserve for future generations to enjoy and learn from. And preserving the collection, again, we put things on display and they rotate, so we can't keep something out year after year after year. Light can fade it. We always risk damage from moths and pests, that sort of thing. So what I really enjoyed when I started at the museum, we had a Hispanic Heritage Wing that had the same exhibit up for 18 years. And right before I started, they made the decision to take down that exhibit and remodel the wing so we could have changing exhibits. So the real joy in that for me is getting to bring out more of these objects. A lot of the Harvey collection also was in Familia Fe when that was up, but this is a way to rotate objects and bring out new pieces, so some pieces that might not have been seen for years and years can come out on display, and as we change things out, it informs a lot of the future exhibits we're doing. On the right again, where the shawl is, you see this beautiful trastero or freestanding cupboard. Trasteros are a late addition to the furniture tradition in New Mexico. They're usually 19th century. You don't see as many from the 18th century in existence. Most of the ones we have are 19th century, and this is a beautiful example of late 19th century work. It is produced wood panel, it's not hand adzed. Again, with the railroad coming in, we were able to get wooden supplies and different industrial equipment from the east, and that helped inform and change our panels and different things. So you'll see beading and spun wood on there. You'll see different designs that aren't the hand-carved ones from earlier pieces. This one is a wonderful example, though, of the colonial taste for deep, rich jewel tones and dark colors. And in the collection, we have several painted pieces of furniture and trunks that show. This is a gorgeous dark green. And on the side, there are pomegranate detailing, which is an emblem that stems back to Moorish times in Spain that comes over. And the pomegranate flower is very similar to the squash blossom that you see here as well. So both symbols become very popular and used a lot in New Mexican art. I always love these pieces because in the 80s we had that big explosion of Santa Fe style or New Mexico style where everything was pastels. That's when mauve carpet was really popular in many homes. And you had light blue, there was always the sky blue or what people call sunset colors, but very subdued, the pinks and blues. But when you're looking at pieces like this from the colonial period and later the territorial period in New Mexico, because these traditions certainly didn't die when the U.S. came in, they were still being done. It'd be later that some of the traditions started dying out, so these were continuing, and that taste for deep hues and jewel tones was still there. And out of the furniture collections museum, this is one of my favorite pieces. And I should say a lot of these are done by anonymous artists, so a lot of colonial art in New Mexico, you did not know who made the piece. We don't have the names of furniture makers. In Mexico, sometimes it's easier to place a maker. Obviously, when you're working with fine silver and different things, there will be a mark. There were guilds that mandated rules and regs for producing items, but since we were the northernmost frontier, we didn't really adhere as much or belong as much to that. So our items were made basically by local craftsmen for use in the home. This is a pot that I did include in New World Cuisine, and probably my favorite part of the Harvey collection, along with, there are beautiful textiles and weavings and all these things, but I really have a fondness for utilitarian objects, and New World Cuisine was kind of my way to kind of display that obsession. It was an exhibit about colonial mixing, and what's in the food world and food history is called the Columbian Exchange. So when you had the meeting of two worlds, I kind of used the title as a new world of food, not just referencing the new world as people call it, but it was a new world of culinary experimentation and exchange and ingredients mixing and food items traveling that had never been seen before. So for those of you that have gone to the exhibit, chocolate is something that came from the Americas. It was cultivated, it was harvested here, it was used here. Europe, the rest of the world had never seen chocolate. Consequently, wine, the grapevines that came over had never been here before. So there was this exchange that took place, and I'm a lover of both chocolate and wine, so I'm happy the Columbian Exchange happened via food. So for that exhibit, it was really fun to bring out items that were developed during the colonial period. A lot of Europeans did bring over their food services and how they ate and served soup bowls, different things. They adopted the use of the mano and metate for grinding corn, learned how to incorporate that into the colonial kitchen. You'd often have a mano and metate and a mortar and pestle. However, there's also items that were developed and invented during the colonial period in the Americas, in Peru, in Mexico, New Mexico. These items were used and developed here and then transported back to Spain. The use of copper, of course, predates Europeans coming over. They used copper also in Europe. There was copper in Spain for centuries. So coming here and finding copper as well, these big, huge storage jars and casos and items. So you had copper to wash your woolens in, to dye wool in. You had copper to cook in, from small pots to large pots. And one of the fun developments, which I don't have an image of, is the copper chocolate pot, which is one of those hybridizations of cooking that happens. Chocolate prehistorically was used in cylindrical jars and poured from high above. The Spanish developed a pot where you can whip it with a molinillo or a whisk, and you had a bulbous shape on the bottom in which to fit that whisk, but it was still a cylindrical copper pot, and you don't really see that form before coming over to the Americas. That didn't exist in Europe. However, it's very similar to coffee and tea throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East. And again, Spain was ruled, or had 800 years of Moorish rule in the south of the country. Spain wasn't united yet at that time. The tabaquera is, these are wonderful examples of personal items that finer homes would have. Tabaqueras were made of silver. In Mexico, there's many examples of silver and gold. And again, certain techniques that were brought over, but then changed and adapted once they came to our part of the globe. In New Mexico, these items were usually imported up, but not always made here. But there were also tabaqueras that were used out of leather, hide, scrotum, different things. So if somebody's out in the Campo on horseback and at a campfire, you normally wouldn't take your fancy silver tabaquera with you. Tabaquera comes from the word tobacco, so it's basically a tobacco flask or pouch. Punche was the common term for tobacco. Many of these belong to women as well as men, and a lot of times the ones we have in the collection will have initials of whoever their owner was. I was looking through the records, and sadly, there is a tabaquera that I have not seen, and looking at it, there was a piece that was stolen back in the 80s from the museum collections, from the Harvey collection, and had never been found, and there's paperwork reporting it missing and removing it, deaccessioning it from the collection because it had not been found, and it was a tabaquera that had silver and gold on it. And those, again, you normally find in Mexico. We haven't really found a lot of any gold examples up here in New Mexico. So tragically, we don't have that piece to see today. Here's one of my absolute favorites in the collection. Back to chocolate history and also back to colonial hybridization of food services and forms. So again, you have Europeans coming who have never known or seen chocolate, but very quickly become obsessed with it and realize that this is a drink to stay, this is a great thing. I might mention it was a drink, it wasn't a bonbon or a candy bar. Originally it was used by royalty, higher ups in society for medicinal and spiritual purposes, ceremonial purposes. So your upper echelons of Aztec society would use it, but it wasn't for everyday and for the common folk to be used. And a lot of our early images of chocolate were servants serving it to the higher ups and that sort of thing. And in Mexico, it stays something that's a formal service for higher society, but it takes on, and more people really start drinking it. In New Mexico, it is the everyday drink of choice. We weren't drinking a lot of teas and coffees here. We were drinking chocolate, and it was a daily ritual of what is called the merienda, which again stems back to Arabic times in Spain, comes over during the colonial period. It is a custom. We've all heard of the tertulia, where people gather and discuss intellectual topics of the day or share art and poetry. And at those tertulias, it was usually done during the merienda. Sometimes a tertulia could go well into the evening and become a party all night. But the merienda was that time of day. And in the Latino world, they still do merienda today, but you had your lunch, and then sometime between lunch and dinner, which seemed to be that long stretch of afternoon, and I don't know how many of you get those afternoon drowsies here. I do. We usually get a 15-minute break to down a coffee or espresso or go outside and get some sunlight, and we come back in, go back to work. But the merienda is more about sharing and communicating and taking time out of the day to really recharge and rejuvenate. Then you can go about your business and get ready for dinner later. But the merienda also, you had something to sustain you until late hours. And throughout many of, in Spain, Argentina, different places, they eat a lot later than we do. So merienda is usually around 5 or 6. It's not 2 or 3 in the afternoon like we're used to. And when I travel to these places to do research and stuff, sometimes I'm starving by dinner because Spain, you won't eat until after 10 at night sometimes. You've been walking around all day trying to look at collections and meet this person and that. So that merienda becomes necessary. But it's really fun to go out and see that tradition continuing too. But this piece, chocolate was the main drink during the merienda. And it was the Viceroy of Peru for which this piece was named and developed. And there's 2 different theories out there. The more common one was that he had Parkinson's disease and chocolate, and when he was serving chocolate to other dignitaries or at parties or gatherings, there was the fear of dropping the chocolate onto his fine outfits and also doing that in front of people, which would be embarrassing. However, the other theory is that it was developed solely so these ladies in their finery could not spill chocolate on them. And there's some really fun stories during the colonial period about women's obsession, in particular with chocolate, and women having servants deliver chocolate to them in the church and getting in trouble with the priest because they were interrupting mass. Just in Mexico City, there was a big court case about this because several women kept having their chocolate brought in. They were finally banned from mass, and they decided to take mass over at the monastery with the nuns where they could still have their chocolate. And later that priest was poisoned. I don't know by who or how, but probably drinking chocolate. So anyways, so that story about not wanting women to spill on their finery also could make sense. However, the Monserina combines, early on chocolate was drunk out of gourd jicaras, or ceramic cups that were shaped like gourd jicaras. They were handleless cups that you could hold in the palm of your hand, a very wide rim, because chocolate was a really thick drink. And then when you had vanilla galleon trade, you had these Chinese porcelains coming over. So in Mexico developed the blue on white pottery tradition out of Puebla that we all see, the beautiful jars and servicewares. You get handleless ceramic cups or jicaras. So what you get here is the saucer or plate with a fixed ring around it. And I always have people ask if this is to keep your chocolate warm. And it's not, because you have all these holes and decorative patterning around. So it really was to hold your chocolate cup. So it could be served, you could carry it around with you, or if it was shared, it could be passed around. But you could have your little biscuits and bonbons and delights or breads with your chocolate. And so I really love the story of an old world tradition and old tradition from the Americas, and then the European ceramics and silver coming over, and you get this new form of serviceware that had never existed until the colonial period. And then it was developed in Peru, but then these were made in ceramics, they were made in silver, and these were sent and made throughout Europe. So you'll see French Manserinas and Spanish-made Manserinas. 5 minutes or totally done?
Like 2 minutes?
2 minutes? Okay, one more item. I have a lot of pictures, but this is the large chocolate storage jar. Prehistorically, prior to the arrival of the Spanish, cacao beans were used as monetary device. They were highly prized. The Aztec exacted tribute from all of the other tribes they'd conquered. They had to pay in chocolate, cochineal, something for taxes. So when the Spanish arrived, they realized that chocolate was highly valuable as well. When you had the Manila galleon trade, you had ceramics coming from Asia. And then the blacksmithing tradition in Mexico, you would have locking iron lids. So these were like storage safes to keep your cacao beans safe. And there are examples of counterfeit beans. People would actually try to pay for something with counterfeit chocolate. So if you had a store of chocolate, you kept it under lock and key. This storage jar is about this tall and this big around. So I've been looking at a lot of accessions records referring to it as a chocolate jar. However, in Christine Mather's book on colonial frontiers, when Herman was looking at this piece, it was said that it was used to store wine. So the lock does open, you can smell in there, and it's highly debatable. There is a hint of both in there, I would say, so you can't really say one way or the other which one it was used for specifically. And I will end there, or I can just flash real quick.
Flash.
Okay.
Flash.
A silver mirror used on an altar in a church. That one was in New World Cuisine as well. I didn't get into horse gear, but the Harvey collection has one of the most beautiful collections of colonial horse gear, I think, in the Southwest. This is the Curator, which goes on the rump of a horse. Again, Arabic tradition in Spain, Andalusian horses, the Spanish barb coming over into the U.S. and starting the whole cowboy tradition here. A horse breastplate, just exquisite. This has coins from Peru, France, Mexico, Chile, and silver filigree work on it. Also in our collection, we have a beautiful Navajo silver horse breastplate that's exquisite. So I love seeing these two side by side. And then the saddle, the tooled leather work of the Charro tradition down in Mexico. Just exquisite again, and we have several saddles in the collection. And finally, a genealogical book from Spain dating back to early 1700. And this is another of the pieces that we tested for cochineal and had in the exhibition. Are there any questions? I know you have a short window for lunch and we started late, but yes.
Is there any provenance to where these were found?
Very little, actually, and I'm not sure. I'm looking into colonial frontiers. Christine mentioned several times that a lot of paperwork of provenance was lost. However, in other instances, we know two specific rare book dealers that Herman dealt with, so this probably came from one or the other of those book dealers. So in some instances, we can look and see. The hide painting, there is a little bit of provenance on that piece. Yes?
My father was on the board of the Fred Harvey Fine Arts Foundation when it went, the collection went to folk art.
Mm-hmm.
And I seem to remember him talking or writing about church bells. Are there mission bells also?
Yes, we have a large grouping of mission bells, and I think all of them are Fred Harvey collection.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, and they're just wonderful pieces.
Thank you.
How many pieces in the collection?
Total of 150.
I remember some things that weren't actually unwrapped yet when I visited long ago.
Oh, really?
In beautiful wrapping in wood cases, and yeah, and it was a long time ago in Bertha Dutton.
Wow, that would have been nice to see.
She was on the board too.
Ah, great. Well, I figured I was very nervous talking to you guys.
Thank you for this. I'm fascinated at how much trade there was, and I guess was it from China to Manila, the Philippines, and then to Veracruz, or how?
Yeah, it would come into Acapulco, then Mexico City, and then out through Veracruz to Europe. It would go down into Chile, to the Caribbean, and then up the Camino Real to New Mexico. So it's hard for us to think, but Mexico City was a world trade center at the time. You had all directions coming in and going out.
Transportation from here, Mexico City was all by donkey.
Pretty much horse, donkey, and it was the carreta and the carro. A lot of people imagine the two-wheeled carreta coming all the way from Mexico City to New Mexico, but that's not true. The carreta was used only for local use in short distances. So you'd have a carro, which was your four-wheeled wagons that would bring caravans up into New Mexico. Anything else?
I didn't quite catch what cochineal is. I know coccinelle in French is ladybug, but yeah.
It looks a lot like a ladybug. Cochineal it's an insect. People often call it a beetle. Technically, it's not a beetle. We dealt with a lot of entomologists when we were doing the cochineal show because we didn't know a lot of the terminology and worked with ethnobotanists and different people. But it's a bug, and it's a parasite that grows on the prickly pear cactus, and it's cultivated and harvested early on, even before reaching Mexico. It was down in Peru, and it grew naturally everywhere. So in early prehistoric and pre-Columbian Peruvian textiles, you'll see a lot of cochineal. However, they didn't farm it. They'd go out and gather it in the wild. But in Mesoamerica, it was farmed and harvested, so the quantities grew a lot more. Pre-Columbian works don't exist because of climate, so that it's harder to find early examples of cochineal in Mexico because they were in a more moist tropical region and things disintegrate quicker, whereas in Peru, it was the drier climate where these pieces exist. In New Mexico, it was imported and used here, basically the Spanish bringing it up and using it here. Also, Navajo weavings incorporating it and being used in different traditions, but it doesn't really grow that well here. You can find it on cacti once in a while. If you see white cotton on a prickly pear cactus, just go over and squish it in your hand, and if you get a little red blood looking on your hand, that's the cochineal bug. They're very, very small, very small. Okay, well, thank you for coming this morning.
Okay, everyone, we'll see you at 1:15. Make sure you have your little card that has an S on the back of it for Saturday. If you didn't get one, I'm sure it'll be fine. But we'll see you at 1:15.
This is Dr. Charles Harvey.
I'll catch up with you. If you want to go on ahead, I just want to see. I'll catch up with you. I have to make stuff.
No, let's go.
I have one.
We are
so I remember. But you guys maybe should communicate about
I'm trying to do a research project though. I'm trying to also look at all the languages from my father. I'm trying to look at Fred Harvey collection to folk art music. A lot of Native American and actually other folk art, and he also collected some stuff. So do you have a car sort of?
So that was part of where I was going.
Yeah,
with it.
I
just wanted, so I just wanted to make sure that you're familiar with him, because what he did, for instance, at Herd was during the period of time after when they created the foundation until it was kind of divvied up, he kept adding things to the collection, and so there's a lot of things.
I know somebody told me about you, who's a mutual friend, because I'm also
Steve's an Egyptian archaeologist.
in Egypt, but also curator at times, and somebody said, oh, you got meet my friend Nicolasa. Just wondering who it was. Anyway, my friend Bill Amherst, you know, he was Native American studies. Well, I'll pick it up later, but I want to contact you because it's actually a little hard to database online to figure out all of the provenance and donation information in your collection. And I'm just looking for a way in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's what I want to do. Yeah.
Because I haven't delved into as much.
Understood. No, it was great. It was really nice.
I know, right? I was thinking, I was like,
Collection.
Exactly. And he
That
collected
book
like
was
a
published, they
ephemera.
still belong to him.
He died in 2005. So, but he lived in Boston the last 25 years of his life,
So
something
like
like
I'm
that.
going through his notes and journals and his papers, and there's also a lot of correspondence that may or may not be in museum from, for example, from Du Bois.
I'm assuming most of it is with your stuff.
I remember meeting Du Bois as a kid, and later on, because I guess she died in the 70s.